So hello, thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is the final event of this year's Leeds Opera Festival. This year's festival's theme has been power. So I've been looking at political power, patriarchy, all sorts of different things. So it's great to be ending this year's festival looking at energy and climate on that theme. This session is all about sharing knowledge, expertise, and ideas on how to make our work more environmentally sustainable and how we can effectively make work that responds artistically to the climate crisis. This first session is focused on how we actually make that work, and session 2 at 3:45 is focused on the messaging of the work itself. If you've got any questions for our panelists this afternoon, please do put them in the YouTube chat, or if you'd prefer, you can email them to info@northernoperagroup.co.uk, and we'll keep an eye on the inbox this afternoon. So we're going to go straight into our first session, and I'd like to ask our panelists to very briefly introduce themselves, starting with, on the left of my Zoom, is George.
Hello, I'm George. I'm the Assistant Production Manager at Opera North and a freelance theatre and performance designer.
Thank you. Marla?
Yes, my name is Marla. I'm predominantly a freelance dance artist, climate justice activist, and I work for SAIL, who are Leeds-based organisations supporting the arts and cultural sector to be more sustainable in how they work. So I deliver carbon literacy training for them, and then have started doing some environmental consultancy work for different dance companies as well.
Thank you. And we've got Siobhan and Roberta as well.
Hello, I'm Siobhan Bauer. I'm the research assistant on the Theatre Green Book case study project, and this is the PI.
Hi, my name is Roberta Mock. I'm Professor of Performance and the Executive Dean of the School of Performing and Digital Arts at Royal Holloway, University of London, and I'm the Principal Investigator of the project called Transitioning to Sustainable Production across the UK theatre sector, and we've been doing case studies of Green Book productions.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much all for you for joining us this afternoon. I know George is going to have to leave us a bit early, so I'm going to start by picking on George. So as you said there, you currently work in the production department of Opera North, but you've also got that background as a designer yourself and actually working on some productions with quite a heavy degree of recycled, reused materials.
Yes.
Could you kind of tell us a bit about that freelance design experience on kind of some of the shows that you've done and how you've actually gone about making some of those shows practically?
Yeah, I mean, the main one I think that's worth discussing is the production of Seven Deadly Sins that happened November 2020. So that was with Opera North, but before I started in my previous position, so I was a freelance working with them as a freelance designer. And the brief for that was to utilize existing stock, both from what we kind of refer to as live shows and dead shows that have happened in previous times. So where the benefit to opera companies generally is that they're already set up to be quite sustainable as a model in the way that operas are revived and done multiple times, over quite a long period of time, so years or decades sometimes. So the infrastructure that comes with that means that there is normally quite a wealth of in-house stock to use as a starting point and to provide quite a lot of inspiration, to begin with. So with the case of the Seven Deadly Sins, we approach the design process very much as we would do a kind of a traditional design process and going, right, what the concept that we would like is this. It happened to be a film studio, kind of 1950s film studio. So that is the aim of what we try and put out and, let the audience see. So with that kind of final aim in mind, we then reversed the process and went, right, so if that's what we're trying to achieve, what is there that already exists that fits in with that process and that concept? And if there isn't something that fits with that, how can we utilize something else and adapt and reuse something in a slightly different way to maybe what its first use was? And if we are buying things new, where are they coming from? Are they secondhand? How are we getting them up to Leeds? Are they all these kind of logistical questions. And that was our first focus. Is it's kind of bigger than the actual going, right, well, we found something secondhand, so that's great, it's not coming new. But actually, if that then is traveling from America, then obviously the kind of carbon footprint of getting it here has to be taken into consideration. Whereas actually, if we spend a bit more time sourcing something more locally, it doesn't necessarily have to be down the road, but even if it's in kind of the same part of the country or the same country, because a lot of things now do come from incredibly far away when they don't need to, and then going, well, say if we do need to get something from London, for example, is there something else that we need that we can get and combine that trip? Or is there somebody else we know where there's somebody's mentioned that they've got a van already coming from London, so can that go on that van? And how kind of starting this communication between different channels of sectors of the industry, really, to go, how can we all benefit each other and utilize these processes that we all know and we've all done for a long time, but if we open up a conversation, we can do our bit to both keep all of our own costs down, because then if one van is doing a trip for 3 different people, that's in a 3-way split of cost, whereas as opposed to one, each of us having to pay for our own transport of something. So that provided a really interesting and unique starting point to how to achieve the kind of what was a period show, in terms of things had to be quite specific. And like I say, it was beneficial in that Opera North does have, we've got a 70,000 square foot warehouse of shows that are in the current repertoire, but then anything that's in the kind of old repertoire, everything, all the furniture, all the cloths, all of the raw materials, we get stripped away and go into general stock. So it's we're in a very fortunate position compared to compared to other companies, in that we do have that existing, there's existing materials and things to pick from, and which is also then beneficial in that we can then start to open up that conversation as well between local companies of going, well, if somebody does need something, send us an email or send us, and we'll see how the possibility of that, we can kind of start a bit more of a network of sharing, really.
Well, I think that was going to be my follow-up. So, I mean, I went to the Opera North stores for the first time the other day, and yes, it is quite humongous. You also had a lot of toys to kind of play with on this one. I mean, I suppose an open question to anyone. This is a very specific example, wanting to make a show by, reusing old materials, basically. I mean, is this something that can be done by smaller companies, you say, that don't have 70,000 square foot warehouses? I mean, is this a sort of model that can be easily replicated? Or I suppose, what are the ways that people might look to do that if they don't have quite such resource behind them?
We could probably start answering that.
Yeah.
The issue of storage has been coming up nonstop for 2 years from companies at all sorts of levels. Partly we have the big companies, the national theatres, the RSCs and so on, and Opera North, who have large stores, but have possibly traditionally not catalogued them particularly well, to make them sort of searchable, for instance, to smaller companies to look up online. I visited the RSC stores for the first time about 2 weeks ago, and it was absolutely fascinating, because you can, especially the costume stores, you can't put every pair of socks and every pair of underwear and every crinoline online, right? At a certain level, you actually have to get into the stores and look at things.
Yeah.
So there's always a balance between ensuring that theatre makers of all scale are aware of what the stores are on a national and particularly regional and local level before they travel somewhere to look at them, but also the huge amount of labor that's actually involved in the cataloging itself, and then knowing what's in and out of stores at any given point and any time. So there is, as George was saying, there's a trade-off between the travel to get something and the ordering of something, and also, of course, the energy costs of storing those things in the first place, because, you know, keeping those things temperature controlled and able to be used at short notice also is, you know, consumes energy as well as human labor. So this is something that comes up in every field and every area that we've been looking at. But certainly local and regional companies are looking to create sharing networks and hubs and good information. So that's certainly happening down here, and I can talk more, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation.
No, it's a very useful one, and I think as well, maybe this might be a good opportunity to say a little bit more about what Roberta and Siobhan, you're actually doing at the moment in terms of the Theatre Green Book case studies, because you're looking at 3 companies of different scales and how they're actually looking to make their work more sustainable. So I won't say any more. What is it that you're doing?
So those of you who aren't familiar with the Theatre Green Book, or perhaps you're already working with the Theatre Book, George, were you using the Theatre Green Book? I'm curious.
Yes, we are, and
Okay.
particularly over the next year, there's a project coming up that has a big focus on implementing
Oh, excellent.
things outlined in the Green Book, but I can't say too much about exactly what that is.
No, though. So I think by this point, most people are familiar with it if they're not using it. But it's 3 volumes created or led by Paddy Dillon, who's an architect. There's 1 volume on
Sustainable productions, which
Productions.
is what our focus is on.
And the other one is building and operations.
Yeah, the second one is building,
Yeah.
and the third one
Yeah.
is operations. So our focus is on volume 1, sustainable productions
Yes.
in particular. And our project is funded by the Creative Industries Policy and Economic Evidence Center. I always get that wrong, which is a consortium, AHRC and Nesta, and also Arts Council England. So they also co-commission this project. So we're following 3 productions that opened this summer, all of which are following the Theatre Green Book. And they're all at slightly different scales. So our first production was Theatre Alibi's Riverland, community company, an ACE NPO, and their show was sort of open in their project base in Exeter for a week.
Smaller scale, obviously.
Yes, and there are small scale example. Our large scale example is the RSC's Allswell at Enswell that opened last week. And they are our large scale example, but also an NPO. And our third example is National Theatre Scotland's Exodus, which opened a few weeks ago and is touring currently till the end of September. And they are our touring productions. So we've been following all 3 of those productions, looking at particularly how they are handling the materials inventory element of the project, and how useful the specific guidance of the Green Book is, as well as how it's actually being implemented. And as a result of all that, we are writing a policy document when all of the productions close, just to talk a bit more about what we've learned and what we might be able to generalize in terms of infrastructural requirements as a result of doing these case studies. So they're supposed to be representative, although on one level, we have discovered how unrepresentative they are because there are no commercial companies involved. And something that we have discovered is that there seems to be a difference in the ability to implement the Green Book on between the subsidized and commercial sectors. Not only that within subsidized sectors, there's a difference in implementing the Green Book for commercial productions, right? So for instance, although we are looking at Allswell that Enswell, and RSC has been implementing the Green Book more and more for their main house productions. Their productions, let's say like My Friend Totoro, they're not actually trying to implement the Green Book. To some extent, that's because that production was planned before pandemic and before the Green Book. But I think that I thought it was all about commercial sector, but I think we need to be even more aware that within the subsidized sector, there are commercial productions, which also might have issues following the Green Book. So that's one of our kind of findings.
That's very interesting, though, this idea that having a commercial impetus means you can't be sustainable. That's a...
Oh, I didn't say that you can't.
No, I was going to say that's a generalization of what you just said, but maybe there are some more issues there that that's quite interesting to explore.
Perceived barriers.
Perceived, yes, yes. Okay.
Say quickly that, because I'm not sure if it was actually explained, but the Theatre Green Book itself is a kind of voluntary code of practice that people are taking on, because we just talked about it, but we didn't actually say what it was.
It's completely voluntary, and it's also a living document that's growing and changing. So one of the things we're looking at is how it might grow and change based on our case studies. We're working with the Green Book.
Yeah, and I think certainly it's something that people seem to be more and more using, and something that even if people find difficult to implement at first, it's probably something that's worth people having a look at and sort of trying to get to grips with, I suppose. We will talk a bit more about that in a minute, but I'm conscious that we'll lose George. So we've obviously talked about your experience as a freelance designer. Now you're sort of in-house with Opera North. Could you just tell us a little bit about some of the things that you and kind of the team are working on in terms of going forward in how you make the work in a more sustainable way?
Yeah. So our main focus at the moment is looking at how. So with shows that are no longer going to be performed in the repertoire, and the furniture and costumes and the kind of that aspect quite easily goes back into usable stock for future shows. What we're now looking at is actually the infrastructure of the set itself, and the kind of the larger pieces that have been constructed into something. How can we then start to reuse those raw materials in give the actual materials that these things are made out of a second life? So we face that challenge of, we can't necessarily reuse everything, because obviously designers design things to look how they want, and that's their that's their intellectual property to for that to be protected. So actually if we take that what was let's say a 6 meter high by 5 meter wide wall that looks a certain way, well actually if we strip the wood off it and the steel off the back, we've then got the tools to create something else from that. And it then the thing that we're looking at is, because we don't have an in-house workshop, how we then work with our current workshops who build our sets to go, we have the stock of steel, of wood, of cloth, of all these different things. So how can they be repurposed by a kind of commercial workshop to then be able to become something else? And our main thing is to build up quite a good inventory of materials, to then and then actually that can help inform the design process, and we can then involve the designers at that very early stage, going, this is what we have, this is what already exists in terms of we know we've got enough kind of framework and structure for a 6 meter wall. So have that in your mind, that might be a useful thing that you can incorporate into your design, or we can adapt that existing infrastructure to become something similar. But it's that in itself is proving what is it's kind of adding another layer of time time consumption on top of it, which is is not a problem, but it's just finding a way to actually make this a new process, and to create this new process of actually at the end of a show we then almost do what we do at the beginning and break it apart and kind of do the process again but backwards. And then the things that we can't save, where are they going, who are we giving them to, what's happening to them after we do get rid of them. And we're working with a company in Manchester, so relatively local, called Stockyard, who do take and recycle and again strip away the raw materials the kind of the next level that we can use them, and they kind of then will chip wood and make it into sustainable fuel. And it's all this kind of acknowledging we can go so far, but actually there are things that we also can't do, but then there's a very informed decision of, if we can't do it, somebody else can. And making sure that there's that kind of, it's a circular process as opposed to a linear one. And that the Theatre Green Book is exactly what that is informing us with, is how how we make this circular process. And if we do need to buy something new, what's the most sustainable version of that new material, and again, where is it coming from, what's it made out of, and what can we do with it afterwards? Especially in paint and all these things that we paint necessarily isn't, it's not reusable, but actually is there a surface it can go onto that means it can either be very easily painted over or stripped, or it's kind of identifying these new products actually. And there are so many new products coming to the market addressing this, right down to the level of our gaffer tape. There is now Lamarck and our tape companies are looking at creating sustainable tape, so that everything, stage markings, the way we coil cables and all that, we're stripping away like the use of PVC tape, which would normally bind a reel of cable, and we've got Velcro ties and all these things already exist. It's just we're so used to the way things have been that it's now becomes quite a conscious choice to change it.
Yeah, and that's a great example, because you would just never think of your gaffer tape or whatnot, such a staple of your kind of production utility belt. But that's a classic thing you throw away. In cable ties as well. I saw something the other day about reusable cable ties. Again, something never would have thought of, but there's something. You brought up something there, which is one of the big questions I wanted to talk about today, which is this idea of the process, and whether our process has to kind of completely change thinking in this way. I wonder if, Marla, we could bring you in here. I mean, do you think trying to work and make things in a sustainable way means we have to completely rethink how we make work, or is that an alarmist sort of way of approaching it?
That's a really great question. I think in some ways there's also the excitement elements from a creative background in thinking about what those possibilities can be, rather than seeing it as an alarmist statement. A lot of things do have to change. And I think when we think about the climate crisis, it is a systemic issue. And it needs a lot more than individual or surface level changes. It does require that deep work of rethinking a lot of things of how we work and how do we reframe them, and kind of moving away from that consumerist, extractorist, convenient culture to something that is a lot more deep rooted and focuses a lot more on like reciprocity and collaboration. And a lot of what came out earlier that George was saying is about sharing of knowledge and sharing of resources, and recognizing that we don't all need to reinvent the wheel. People everywhere are doing bits of work, they're learning from it. So how do we keep sharing that, learn from each other's mistakes, learn from those successes, and it doesn't have to feel as daunting. Obviously, within the arts and cultural sector, there's a lot to think about in terms of rethinking touring as well, because, for example, in the UK, a quarter of our emissions come from travel, and that's not even including aviation and shipping. So especially within the arts as well, it is a big percentage of what our emissions will be. So there is a lot of rethinking to be done around what does touring look like. But that is also an exciting opportunity to think, what does that open up for the locality? What does that open up for different ideas of touring and what that can look like? And whether it has to become a slower model of touring, but then you're more invested in the communities you go through. There's a lot of options to think about what that looks like. And I think as well, a lot of space for learning and understanding the root causes of the climate crisis and how social justice and climate justice have to come hand in hand, I think is something that is a lot of space to think about. So it can feel really overwhelming, but it doesn't all have to happen at once either. There'll be a lot of different people in different sectors that have information that's feeding into how we work. So I think that it's important to focus on the more creative visioning aspect of what can we imagine can be done differently, how can we move towards that, rather than the overwhelm of everything has to change. I think what can be quite nice is sometimes to think about the habit becoming to question everything rather than having to change lots of different things. Just having that added element of questioning when we are doing things the way we're doing now, where is there a possibility for change, and opening up that dialogue collectively so it doesn't all fall on one individual.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at it, because we can sometimes forget that we are supposed to be actually creative people working in the creative industries. And maybe actually if we just sort of try and think creatively about these things rather than complaining about them, or getting too het up on them, actually that might be a healthy way of doing it. George, I know you need to run away, so could I just ask you, from your process of doing, particularly working on sins, is there kind of one thing as a designer that you've learned or you'd suggest to people when trying to do things in this way that would be good to consider?
To get involved as just at a very early process. I think that was the main thing of allowing the time to explore what things exist, allowing the time to find new materials, and that really early engagement made a massive difference. And we're finding now with the designers we're working with, it makes to really make it like a team, the sense of a team effort, it makes a huge difference to allow the time to do so, and actually solves a lot of problems to have that time, because then it's alternatives can be found in the time can be spent together to come up with something that might work. That's the kind of main piece of advice, I would say.
Great. Thank you. You need to leave, so I'm going to say
sorry I got
George.
to go.
Not at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So we've talked there about potentially the extra time it takes to consider this, looking earlier in the process. The other big question I kind of wanted to talk about related to that is cost. Now, a lot of people kind of say, if we're going to be doing this kind of work, looking at different materials, where we're getting it from, we're not just going on Amazon, we're looking at different ways of finding things. It's more time and it's more expensive. I'd be interested, maybe starting with, kind of Siobhan and some of the case studies you've been looking at. Is finance one of the things that people are coming to you with as a challenge?
Yeah, there's definitely a preconception that sustainability costs more, but I think what we found is that it needn't cost more, but it does take more time, and so it's about how you allocate the money in your budget to begin with, and investing in people, and making sure, for instance, just to follow on from what George was saying, everybody's on the same page from day one. If everybody's signed up to the idea that they're trying to meet at least baseline Green Book standard, then they know that these questions are there from the start. Then they automatically, like you were saying, Marla, the dialogue is already in place. So people do question things they wouldn't have questioned, such as, should we be using this material in the R&D, and at what point? And the actual process timeline shifts slightly, and this is stuff you learn as you go along. So whereas you might leave certain decisions to the end, you just have to flip that process. And so it needn't cost more, but you do need to factor in the lead times for certain things coming.
To give a really good example, with Allswell that ends well, they reused a floor for the first time. It was the first time the RSC reused a floor. Not only did it save like metric tons of materials, but it was a huge part of the budget as well.
Yes.
And that enabled that money to be used in other places. So it needn't, but they needed to know that floor was available, and they needed to make sure that it worked with the other productions in rep on either side and where it was going next. So the entire process, you have to think beyond a production sometimes. And so your time scales change. You're also primarily talking about a freelance and precarious economy and ecology of workers, and you have to pay them a bit more to be around a bit more,
yes,
especially if you're expecting them to do certain types of training. So I have not found that things cost more. There are certain materials that are currently costing more, but as they're being used more, those prices are coming down. I would say that most of the issues are rising related to costs, are related to, dare I say it,
Brexit.
I mean,
Yes.
that's what's causing, and sometimes it's really difficult to disaggregate things that are happening for the first time at the same time. But mainly, you know, people are finding it very, very difficult to build their sets in good time when the set materials are being held up, when they're paying more for those set materials and so on. So there's a combination of things that are happening, but I think the long and short of it is that we haven't really seen any evidence yet that sustainable practice does need to cost more money, except in terms of people time, which is a big exception.
And research to a certain extent, the time that comes with researching new processes. So, but if you think about it, it's obvious, you know, if you're building something and you're thinking about the disassembly process at that start, then you can, if you have the storage, reuse those materials, or you can sell them to somebody else who can reuse them. So I think down the line, it will be more cost effective.
Yeah, so save a floor, pay freelancers more is the lesson that we're going away with today.
Okay, yeah.
My primary school poetry.
That's good.
Marla, do you kind of have any thoughts on this kind of issue of cost? Or again, I suppose, what is it something that people bring to you through the training you do?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's such a nuanced, specific conversation depending on each organisation or freelancer specific situation. But I think thinking about time as well, like the redistribution of time in a process can also avoid time wasted later on when you're having to stress about last minute realizations. If you actually sit down at the beginning of a project and take that time to really think about how to do it in a more sustainable way, that can be really useful. I think in my experiences, a lot of the pitfalls come in terms of financial worries when it comes to things like if you're in a grade 2 listed building and you're thinking about the sort of heating of the space that you're in and wanting to move perhaps towards a ground source heat pump, but realizing that you're still renting the property, you don't have ownership to put those things in place, and it would be expensive in the first place. So that can be quite a difficult, I think, area when thinking about of emissions of working in a building like that. But even looking into better insulation can have such a positive impact on reducing emissions from energy usage. And I also think that there are so many other areas that whilst that might not be something that's in your control, there's other things that you can feed into to reduce, for example, staff travel, having more schemes around car shares and cycle to work schemes and things like that. Also thinking about some of the maybe more invisible things, who you bank with, who pensions are with, those sorts of things, they do matter. And they're the invisible things that sometimes maybe don't get as much attention, but they do make a difference. So I think things like that as well, the power of advocacy, collective learning. If you're engaging a lot of people, how can you bring in spaces where people who might be in positions where they can implement things that you can't as an organization? That sort of sphere of influence, ripple out effect does make a difference, because you're reaching people who maybe didn't have that information, but now that they do, they might be in a financial position to implement those things that you can't yet do. And I think, again, coming back to just sharing of knowledge and having that compassion with each other, to not sort of keep these things insular for yourself, but actually this is something collectively we need to do as a sector, and we can do that by lightening the load of time spent by lots of different organisations if we share the work that we've been doing.
Yeah, and you mentioned some great things there. I mean, so one of the things I wanted to get out of this afternoon, I suppose, is some kind of tactical things we can be doing when we're thinking about our, Arts Council applications, our, environmental sustainability, dynamism, and those little wins. Who do you bank with? That's not something we think a lot about, but actually that is something we can all do. Looking at who that is, and more sustainable banking systems, easy kind of ways, I suppose, in a way that we can start to make progress. I mean, we can only make progress if we sort of know where we are at the moment, I suppose. So again, maybe starting with Siobhan and Roberta. I mean, how can especially smaller companies actually look to measure what their impact is at the moment? How can we know what our starting place is?
Well,
this comes up a lot.
Well, this does come up an awful lot. And one of the things that we've discovered is that there are actually some tensions between carbon calculating and circular economy principles. That carbon calculating doesn't always take into account the sort of conversations, especially that George was leading on, about reuse, recycling, repurposing, and so on. And the long-term life cycles of materials and the relationships with place and community and all of those sorts of things. So what I would say is, in this tension, there is a general expectation that you have to start somewhere, right? You have to start measuring in some way, and that these are very much, they tend to be organization specific. So even with the Green Book, while people are doing their sort of materials inventory, there are many different ways that you can actually interpret reuse. Take a pair of trousers. Are you going to deconstruct them to think about the reuse of every button? Or are you going to think about the reuse of the trousers as a whole? And you can do that with almost every element of the set as well. You know, are you, when you're talking about a flat, are you talking about the frame or the material that's in it, et cetera, et cetera. The important thing is that an organization actually develops a system for itself, because the thing that they're measuring is their own changing patterns and use, yes. Right? It's not to compare with other people or to be naughty or you know, pat yourself on the back. It's actually, you have to start with some sort of measurement base in some way. That could be in terms of whatever is meaningful for your particular organization, but you have to start that. And it could be percentage of materials that are being reused, the percentage of materials that are being recycled afterwards, the percentage of virgin materials, you know, that all of that. Or it could be more about changes to touring practices or whatever. But every organization has to actually set its own baseline. Yeah. And that requires some form of measurement. And whether you want to do it the way the National does by converting everything to air miles, equivalent air miles, and trying to reduce it from that point of view, or actually in terms of percentage of materials reused, as Theatre Alibi, one of our case studies, are doing, the important thing is that an individual organization is actually able to tell its own story. And our conversations with Arts Council England have actually reaffirmed that. Yes, they're the green tools, and those are constantly being reevaluated and redeveloped and becoming more sophisticated, but they really stress to us the importance of the beyond carbon narrative. What are you doing to change? That this isn't about measuring, because you can just game your measurements. It's pretty easy to game your measurements. What you really need to do is create something that's meaningful for your own organization. So you have to measure something, and then you have to be consistent with your measuring, and you have to tell the story of that measuring.
But the main takeaway is to not be afraid to start anywhere, because I think lots of companies think, they get overwhelmed by, oh, I don't know how to actually do the maths here, or, oh, do I have to, you know, what point do I stop? And it's very overwhelming looking at the supply chain for any material. So unless you're scientifically minded or mathematically minded, you can get very overloaded. I think lots of creatives feel that way. But the point is, just start anywhere, just as long as it makes sense to you. And then you've got something to compare and it's relative to.
Yeah. And Marla, so I suppose there's things that you could do as an organization. You just keep a spreadsheet or a tally of things, but are there any sort of online things that people might want to use to either track these things or calculate? I mean, is there anything that people can just sort of instantly get their hands on?
Yeah, I just want to kind of have a quick comment on what was said before. I always find it super ironic that it was BP, the oil company, to be the first ones to publicly advertise the carbon footprint as a way to sort of negate their responsibility and put it onto individual accountability. So it can be really useful to think about having an idea of where you're at, but also it's important to recognise where accountability lies at times as well, and where we spend a lot of our energy and resource, because that sort of accounting again takes a lot of time. If you don't have the resources currently to do that, focusing on the impact of doing is so important. There was research done by the Carbon Brief who found that 2/3 of people would be more willing to take climate action if they knew that other people were doing the same. So again, just doing things, if you make mistakes and learn from it, that's fine. It's still creating the dialogue, it's creating that collective learning, which I think is really important. In terms of resources, obviously online, there's Julie's Bicycle's Creative Green Tool, which is a way to sort of go into that sort of reporting and have specific questions, and that beyond carbon again is really useful to have in there as well, to look at what is happening with regards to behaviour change and how you work and things like that. Another useful bit of advice I just wanted to put in there as well is when you think about kind of job descriptions and contracting, how are you writing in an environmental responsibility to each person's role within the work that they do? So it's an expectation that's already there. I think is a really important thing to think about as well. Obviously, again, as Siobhan was saying, like having that baseline is really important, but whatever that baseline looks for you as an organization is also really valid so that you can measure your progress moving forwards. And as well within the arts, like we're very, very sort of qualitative, I think, in the way we think about things a lot of the time. So some of those measurements aren't as clear cut. So thinking about engagement with local community projects, audience engagement, all of that side of things that aren't as sort of tangibly easy to say, it's this number of things that have been done. It's still super valuable and we need to give space for that. Same with biodiversity, which often gets overlooked, and understanding the benefit of that. Also the health benefits that coincide with that, the connections of all of those things that numbers sometimes don't take into account. And also numbers can be impacted by carbon offsets that you might not always know how justifiable they are, or if that's used as an excuse to not take meaningful action and still look like you've reduced your emissions. So there's a lot of sort of those areas I think to think about as well. But yeah, I'll stop rambling for now.
No, it was very interesting. Can just return very briefly, you mentioned about how you put it in job descriptions, just something I've never thought about. Can you sort of explain what that might look like, or what kind of things you might be asking of people? What might that mean?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the fundamental thing to think about is what role that person has, what actions they'll be doing under that role, and what could the potential environmental impacts of that role be. And perhaps having someone in that role who then has the space within what they're contracted to do to think about how to do that work differently. Then they're basically, that's part of their role, is to create a way of doing that role that is more sustainable, that embeds more climate action in the way they work. So it again delegates the responsibility of where things lie to think more about how things can be done differently. Obviously, there's probably way more ways to think about how that can be implemented depending on the organisation, but I think it's an important thing that people maybe do think about a lot more when they are commissioning people for work or contracting people for different projects.
Yeah, no, that is very interesting, and I think, as we said before, this idea about little things we might not have thought about, but that actually could start to make change. Actually, starting to embed that in an organisation, and not only staff but freelancers as well, is quite an interesting. Just making people aware of it, I think, is always kind of a first step, isn't it? So just a reminder to let us know if you've got any questions. We have had a couple come in by email. We'll get to in a minute. But before we do, there's a couple of other things I wanted to discuss. We've talked so far a lot about making shows, flats and floors and all that sort of stuff, but obviously a lot of work that we do is what you might call participatory, or it's workshops, it's that kind of work. I mean, are there things in that sort of environment that we should be thinking about, or that we might easily overlook rather than just actually, making a show? It's an open question. Well,
I mean, I have to say our case studies have been production based. That is actually the focus of our research study. Theatre Alibi, of course, works within a community context. So the show that we were doing the case study on was actually situated within a week-long local community festival, which involved all sorts of other activities, all sorts of making activities, creative, participatory, educational activities as well. So they saw it as a single practice. Not only that, it was a show, Riverland was actually about this particular area in Exeter, St. Thomas, which floods. So it was a show about sustainability, that they did not want to knock everybody on the head with it, but they wanted to make it sustainably. And they also included it in their promotional materials, that they were making this to a sustainable standard, and that actually impacts as well on the message, and that these are things that are braided together. They are not extra. The sustainability isn't extra. It was part of their entire approach to community, their approach to placemaking, their approach to the role of the company within the community, as well as with other companies and infrastructures as well. So that's a particularly good example, although we were only really doing the case study on the production itself. It cannot be disassociated from all of the other activities around it. So I think that's that's probably the basis for that, because I don't want to be straying into territory that I don't feel.
I mean, one of just as it's a nice thing, but one of the main materials that they used were trees. Yeah. They were little trees, and they did a plant sale at the end, and those trees went back out into the community. And when they sold those trees, there was a story about. So there were other ways of participating with people, with and engaging with people around the show. They had information wall as well, and it was in all of the literature. So yeah, they were very upfront about it.
And there's also shows that are doing more and more to relate to how audiences get to shows as well. So surveys of audience transportation, like the big Unbox Walking the Plank show, they were doing audience surveys when you arrived, about how you got there, and so on. And I've also participated in conferences that talked about working with local transportation networks to ensure, for instance, that there are buses to get back from the theatre, that sort of thing. So to some extent, participation also includes audience members who come to see these productions that are being made sustainably. And a lot of discussion about, there has been a lot of discussion as well as to what extent do you tell audiences about the sustainable work underneath the productions. So we do know that a survey was done, a big survey of about 12,000 audience members was done. And the results were that 87% of audience members that were surveyed said that they expect productions to be made sustainably, which is wild, but it also makes you wonder, well, how are they finding out about whether they're being made sustainably, and what role do they have in ensuring that, and also monitoring it? So I guess that's a broad way of considering participation around a more traditional theatre production, but obviously there's lots of people involved in socially engaged practice that do it in other ways as well.
And you can start thinking about procurement as well.
Well, procurement is huge.
Who you're working with, who you're contracting with. So there's that ripple-on effect, I'd suggest.
Yeah, and that that reminds me, that's something we've been doing for a few years now, which is when you're telling audiences about a show, we always tell people how you get there by public transport first. We always tell them where you can put your bike and those sorts of things. And we also make sure that if we're doing participatory or audience shows, that like you said, is it somewhere where you can get a bus back into town at the end of it? It's not scheduled at a time when the last train's gone. I think there's just all those sorts of things that people don't always think about, but actually, again, we're looking at these sort of quick wins with the Arts Council, as well as being sustainable. Have we thought about what time the show is on? Have we thought about the trains? Have we given people the timetables? All those sorts of things actually are ways that we can, without having to do really much work, we can start to make some sort of difference. One of the other things I just wanted to talk about before we come on to some of the questions is, you mentioned earlier touring. That a lot of the emissions come from touring and travel, and it's something that obviously is part of the Green Book. Could you start by just telling us a little bit about this thing called a Green Rider and what exactly that is?
So something just fell. So I first I first found out about the idea when I was looking at the live events industry for a previous project that we were working on. It was mostly to do with music touring companies. And there was this question about who was responsible for these emissions when it comes to travel. Is the onus on the venues for parts of it? Is the onus on the managers, the producers, the artists themselves? And there's this kind of passing the buck that goes on, or thinking it's not your fault, or something that you should be doing, something somebody else with more money and time should be doing. Of course, nobody has that. So the idea of the contract, the Green Rider, is it's a form of contract that you bring to the table really early on, and you say, this is how I can kind of become a master of my own domain in terms of agency, and say, this is a very small thing that I can do, which is say, I only want to work with venues that have, renewable energy, for instance, or getting this much from solar energy, or have vegan options. Or so that's Coldplay, for instance, was the big example for the what's it called? The Spheres.
Music of the Spheres.
Music of the Spheres.
Yeah, so every merchandising comes up an awful lot about The big issue in live events with technical riders is no disposable plastics. Make sure that there's no disposable plastics.
In the venues.
For theatre touring companies, a lot of green riders specify that there shouldn't be any print and paste materials, that all promotion should be digital. On the other hand, there are knock-on effects because a lot of people think that digital means zero carbon, which it really doesn't, but there's an education campaign around that as well. But certainly it's better than paper and paste. So
I can say one thing that led on from that was this worry that artists, if they put these things in their rider, that they were going to become kind of abandoned or that they would become pariahs essentially, or we don't want to deal with them, they're drama queens, they want to save the planet. So there was an emphasis there that artists needed to be supported more. There needed to be more robust scaffolding there to kind of support the people who apparently are the most important and yet kind of cast aside. So that was how I first came across it. But then part of the Green Book and working to baseline standard is that you get everybody on board, as George was saying earlier as well. His main takeaway was get the conversation started as soon as possible. Ideally have the conversation before any contracts are even exchanged. And that means that, your designer isn't coming in blind from day one. They know that they have to work to a certain standard. The actors as well, which we've just discovered isn't always the case, that the actors aren't even, this isn't built into their contracts. Absolutely everybody. And it's a way that you're getting that conversation on the table really, really quickly. And it should be treated in the same way that health and safety is, or health and well-being when it comes to how many hours you should be working, or and especially for freelancers, precarious workers who might be coming into a situation that they didn't know they were walking into and then being expected to learn all of this stuff on top, whereas actually they could kind of prep themselves slightly, or they could choose to only work with companies that are practicing a shared value system to their own. So
but in general, I mean, there's the insertion in of expectations in employment contracts. And then I think the easiest way to describe the Green Rider, what did you describe it as earlier? It's like a statement of expectations between touring organizations and their venues.
Yes.
And actually saying, we're playing our part. How are we going to work together to ensure that a touring practice, which is, as I heard someone say at some point, is of itself necessarily not of place, is actually can become as of place as possible. And there are many different, there are many ways to tackle that we have explored. But one way of actually thinking about it, and certainly National Theatre of Scotland thinks about it all the time as a non-building based company that tours, is that think about all of the audiences that are not coming to the urban centres when you bring the production out to them, that there is a different sort of transportation. You have to think about things very holistically. You might have to think, for instance, of building your sets with lighter materials in order to transport them, about using electric vehicles, for instance, or in order to do that. We've talked to companies that have done all of these various things. And I think the important thing is, as Marla said earlier, everything is context specific.
Yes.
What are you trying to do? And you have to balance all of these things out. But the Green Rider actually is a way of saying to your venues, we have expectations of you that we expect the partners that we work with to be also acting in a sustainable way. And these are some ways that we think that you might be able to tackle that.
And it'll be interesting to see from what you said at the beginning as well, this difference between the subsidized and commercial sector as well, whether, again, my assumption, which might be horribly wrong, is that, again, a subsidized theatre would be more willing to consider some of those things than perhaps in a commercial environment, but I might be completely wrong. But it'd be interesting to look at that difference.
There's two things to say about that. The first thing is, first of all, it's our sort of mea culpa that we are not actually doing a case study of a commercial production that's doing it. On the other hand, I don't know of any commercial productions that are using the Green Book. And maybe that is in itself interesting right at this point. Another thing is that those big commercial productions that are up for 10 years, they're the most sustainable productions going. because the entire set isn't going into a skip in well, presuming they don't close.
Or, we have to look at their pyrotechnics as well and their merchandise, and I think it's not that simple.
So there is an awful lot going on. So first of all, we haven't actually tested it, and there's a lot of assumptions, but there's also a lot of movement of people being trained in the subsidized sector that move back and forth constantly between subsidized and commercial. And what they're doing is they're bringing their practices with them. Right. So there's an awful lot sort of going on in that space. I don't think we should dismiss the commercial sector. I don't think that they were definitely part of the development of the Green Book. I'm not saying that they weren't, but also the subsidized sector aren't reporting their environmental policies to Arts Council England through their NPO reporting. So that does give a certain impetus to be doing stuff. Right. So the MPO companies are reporting, and also to Creative Scotland as well. So the commercial companies don't have that imperative sitting right there, and I think ACE's commitment to the sustainability pillar and showing it through the MPO reporting mechanisms are changing people's practice, changing the subsidized theatre sector's practices.
Yeah, and I think that you say the key word there is impetus, isn't it? Well, I think, as you said before, if 87% of audiences expect work to be made sustainably, across all sectors and scales, hopefully there'll be an impetus from all people, whether they have to do it for the Arts Council or not, that we want to see work being made in this way. So we just had a question, and you were talking there about marketing and wanting to go all digital. Someone saying that they work with rural communities, 100% of audiences come through print. The only way they can do it is driving around, handing out flyers and putting up posters. Marla, is there anything on that kind of? We obviously don't want to lose audiences by going digital only. If we're looking at having to stick with these traditional methods, is there other things that we can be thinking about if this is a necessity, I suppose?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think in a lot of ways, it's also allowing the space for options, opt-ins and opt-out options, and having sort of like what a baseline is, and then there's an option for an alternative if that suits someone better. Because we also have to take in mind something that's happened, for example, is a lot of digital programs, and then maybe only having access to a digital program and not a physical one. And for example, if you don't have a phone that can scan a QR code, or for any other reason you require a physical version of it, that option should still be available, and it can still be sourced as sustainably as possible, for example, from recycled materials to be re-recycled, or for example, someone can return it at the end of a show if they're happy to do that, but still have access to something physical. So thinking of reuse within that, because I think it is important to not exclude anyone through decisions we make, and that can sometimes be what is an issue. If you try and take an action that you think, great, this is going to be more sustainable, but have not thought about how that's going to then subsequently impact people, that's a really important thing to keep in mind. So it does take that additional reflection and thought, and having conversations with people you currently engage with the work, and just being like, we're thinking of doing this route, would that work for you, would it not? And having those conversations again, and just that transparency of you're trying to make a change, but doing it in a way that doesn't leave anyone out of that space.
Yeah, as you said, I think it is this balance, isn't it, between wanting to do things in a more sustainable way, but not alienating people at the same time. And obviously, what we're not saying is stop touring, stop these sort of things. It's just, as you said, where are we now? What can we do that's better? We don't have to be perfect, but what can we do that is going on the right sort of track?
There are ways. First of all, not using plasticized paper, using recycled paper. Encouraging people to using vegetable ink, encouraging people to recycle those, delivering by bicycle or electric car.
Using hydro vegetable oil in your vans and updating your vans that you use for touring as opposed to old diesel vans, simple things like there's low-hanging fruit there.
Yeah, so it's not, I don't think anybody's saying stop doing it, but definitely rethink what you're doing and trying to do it as sustainably as possible. And there's usually some options, usually. Yeah. So I think I might have interrupted you, so I'm going to put mute
on. There's another question which is going back to something we were talking about a little earlier, around going back to the Arts Council, and you mentioned that you're having discussions with them, and this idea of kind of building in some of the cost is sort of welcomed in a way? I mean, do you think that if someone is putting together a project grant and they're wanting to put in money, so the designer has more time or the producer has more time to be able to research and do these sorts of things, is that something you think is welcomed, will be received? Again, we're sort of talking tactically here, I suppose.
I have to actually say that I represent ACE in no way whatsoever.
This is not official, guidance.
However,
No, this is.
What I would say is that it is important to cost realistically, and it is important to cost ethically in terms of what it's actually going to cost you to do something. And I think if you can probably tell a story that by doing this, it is going to help the company, the organization, and ACE meet its sustainability and environmental principles and pillar, then it is completely justifiable, especially if you are thinking about it possibly in relation to not doing something else. So I think in every application, every funding application, there is some form of justification for resources. And I think that is something that would definitely be received. I don't think anybody would receive that and go, oh, they've asked for an extra 7 hours of design costs, we're going to turn that down. That is not going to be the reason why an application is not funded. So I think that to me, you have, ACE says this matters. And so as long as you're not being greedy about it and you're being thoughtful about it and you can justify it, I would say that it would be welcome. But of course, it's not my organization to say, but I think that would be the case.
Great. This is a final call for any questions, info@northernoperaGroup.co.uk, or pop in the chat. The last thing I wanted to ask from all of you is kind of any sort of, kind of top tips, resources. We've mentioned some of those things we might want to look at that we might not usually consider, gaffer tape, contracts, all those sorts of things. So is there anything from you that might be sort of easy wins or easy ways for people to start looking at things differently?
Well, there are a few things that do come up all the time that we can say, and some things that people have found really useful. Laundry is actually one of them, and it's something that that many people have told me they've learned through the Green Book, that they've started to apply in their everyday life. So, for instance, not using fabric softener is one of them. So there are a lot of things that we do in theatre and production processes that actually extend across art. So fabric softener is one of them. Another thing that comes through all of the time, especially related to the commercial sector, balloons.
Oh, balloons.
Confetti,
confetti,
and the chemicals in snow and smoke machines. All of these are things that actually look at chemicals first and foremost. Decide whether you need those chemicals. Look at alternatives to those chemicals. If you're using balloons in shows, can you recycle those balloons? Do you have to use helium? Or could you use, air and tie those balloons up?
Or, as we found out recently, actually get fake balloons
at the back.
If you have a few real ones, and then behind you can have some fake ones.
So those are some really basic things, but those are things that come up all the time. If you're doing confetti drops, remember that's a huge amount of waste right off the top. So look at how you are recycling, how you are hoovering those up. Glitter. Don't use glitter. Okay, so those are really sort of quick and basic things that you can be looking at. And the other thing that I would say in terms of a kind of win, and something that we have discovered, is the importance and use of carbon literacy training. I
was going to say this, yeah.
And if there's one thing that everybody could do, is carbon literacy training of one sort or another. We've been involved with lots of discussions about the development of carbon literacy training for the theatre sector in particular. Society of British Theatre SBTD is actually designing and just accrediting one for designers straight away, but we have also done a lot of carbon literacy training and have discovered that there is a lot of good use of organizational training. So lots of people can be in the room together, but also more generic training for the sector where maybe a lot of freelancers can be in the room and talk about the issues as a freelancer coming into an organization. But the thing about carbon literacy training is it gets you to think about our environmental impact in the widest possible way. And it gets you to think about your own individual commitment and your wider commitment, both possibly in a career-focused way, but also as, you know, citizen of the planet. So I think that for me, that's one of the main takeaways that people could do and should do.
Yeah, I would have said, besides balloons, I would have said carbon literacy training as well. And when I listen to Marla speak, I can hear so much of the carbon literacy training, but in the best way when you talk about the macro and the micro and your individual agency and the organizational agency. It's good. It's yeah, I think it's really important for organizations as well to all kind of be on the same page. And that's one way of doing that. That's actually very easy. It's just about all being in the same space and having a conversation. Yeah. One of the easiest things you should be able to do.
Marla, before we have your top tips, I'll give you 30 seconds to pitch carbon literacy training, which you deliver. So go on, you can give us the sell and then give us your top tips.
Wow, thank you for that one. Well, no, I would basically say it's really a space for collective learning and making people within the arts and cultural sector feel empowered to take climate action. So it gives an overall view of the context. How did we get to where we are with regards to the climate crisis, thinking about the historical implications, the impacts around the world, who's most impacted, our local impacts, and also the responsibilities we have to take action. We look through the sort of trajectory nationally of where we're going, what needs to be done, and then zoom in more sector specific to look at how we can do things as organizations, but also as individuals. So it's very open for people, both who work within organizations, but also freelancers. So there'll always be something to take away that can hopefully empower people to feel like they can go away and do something and take action and have an understanding of what the decisions they make, the impacts of them, and knowledge is power at the end of the day. So it's useful to have that gateway. Great. Hope that was 30 seconds-ish.
Right. Yeah. And any kind of top tips, final things you want to kind of leave us with that people might want to think about?
Sure. So first of all, I would actually say that a lot of organisations I've worked with carbon literacy training, they have often been doing that in tandem with a Theatre Green Book, in all honesty, or having also dialogues with Julie's Bicycle. So actually thinking about what sits around that training is really, really a supportive way of doing it. As well as that, obviously, SAIL are always an organisation to get in touch with. If you're in the film industry, then Albert, Culture Declares Emergency, wonderful resources there, Sustainability and Production Alliance, another great one. I also wanted to just share like a couple of books or podcasts that aren't necessarily arts related, but I think it's important to have that sort of overarching learning to keep going. So a book that I found a really lovely read is Active Hope by Joanna Macy and Chris Johnson. A podcast called From What If to What Next by Rob Hopkins, which also has a book, which is What Is to What If, which I think really captures the aspect of imagination. What is the future we're moving towards? Also The Future We Choose by Christiana Figueres and Tom Rivett-Carnac. And they also have a podcast called Outrage and Optimism. Also would recommend that. I don't know if I can share a screen, and maybe no one else finds this good, but it's just a little diagram that I like kind of reflecting and seeing something visual to help with doing that. So if I can share the screen, I will show you that, but I don't know if I can. Otherwise, I can just talk through what it is. Okay, yes, I can. Amazing. Okay. So it's a Venn diagram that just looks like this. And I think, some of you might have seen it before, but I think it's a really nice way of making your climate action specific for you. So what identities you hold, what brings you joy, the skills you have, what needs to be done, what communities you engage with, and then thinking about what action encompasses all of those things, because it's important that the actions we take are also sustainable, because if we burn ourselves out, we can't keep doing that work moving forward. So it needs to be something that's nourishing for you as well, that encompasses things you're passionate about, skills that you have, engage people who are already in communities you work in, and link up with the work that you do. I think it's really important. So yeah, I'll stop sharing now, but hopefully if you want to take a quick picture of it, then you can. But yes.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Marla. Thank you very much, Siobhan, Roberta, and George, who...
Plug something.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
We are going to be running an online event on the 30th of September, which is called Coming Together. And it's going to be about what we can do as arts and culture organizations working together in network form, in cross-disciplinary form, and almost everything that we're talking about today with representatives from all of our case studies. It's free, it will be online, anybody can join us. So
Yes,
we would love for people who are interested in this conversation to carry on and join us.
Yeah.
Thank you. And if people want to find you online and what you're doing, how do they do that?
Twitter is the best, at Green UK Theatre.
And I'll send you the information, David, as well, and Marla.
Great. Well, I'll see you on the 30th. Thank you all very much again. We're going to take a break now. We'll be back at 3:45, where we're joined by Alison Smith and Michaela French to discuss their experience of making work that seeks to inform, entertain, and confront audiences over the climate crisis. So I'll take a break now, and we'll be back at 3:45. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thanks.
Hello, thank you for joining us again after our little break. So for this second session this afternoon, we're going to be looking more about actually making work that responds to the climate crisis, how we can do that successfully, what that work should be doing. I'm delighted to be joined by two guests this afternoon. Just shut myself up there. So I'd like to start by asking them to introduce themselves, starting with Alison.
Hi, my name's Alison Smith. I'm an artist based in Leeds. My practice is mainly creating light installations and lit sculptures, and I work quite a lot with scientists. So I create work that's mainly for outdoor settings, things like light festivals, music festivals. I've done Light Night in Leeds. I've created a few pieces for Light Night over the years, and similar kind of other events around the country. I work with recycled materials. That's kind of at the core of my practice and has been from the beginning, really, before I even kind of started working with light. And then I create kind of lightscapes using programmed lighting to light sculptures or to kind of combine them with different materials, mainly recycled plastic. So I've my two big pieces that I've created recently are the Nectary, which I made in collaboration with a scientist called Dr. Chris Hassel. I actually developed that piece as part of Opera North and the Cultural Institute at Leeds University's scheme, Leeds Creative Labs. So that's got a bit of an opera link as well. There to Opera North. That is a large piece of 6 huge flower heads that visitors can stand inside and listen to soundscapes of bees. So work directly with Chris and some of his PhD students on that one. Has a very much an environmental narrative around the importance of pollinating insects. And the other piece that I've recently made is called Climate Canopy, which went up to COP26 in Glasgow to the Climate Summit last year. That was made in collaboration with the National Centre for Atmospheric Science, and it actually displays 170 years of climate data, so climate data being very much at the core of that piece. So yeah, that's kind of how my work responds to the crisis. Obviously, creating these, the Climate Canopy in particular, creating a real visual and physical manifestation of the data and showing that kind of real urgency of the crisis.
Great, thank you. And we're also joined by Michaela. Hello.
Hello, David. Nice to meet you, and nice to meet you, Alison. I have to say, in just listening to your introduction, Alison, there's going to be a lot to discuss today, because actually my practice is kind of based in light as well, in a very different way. And David, I think, as discussed, I have got some slides I can show if that's useful. I don't want to take over, only be a few minutes, but if that's useful, shall I do that?
Yeah, please do. You should be able to do that.
So I'm just going to share a moment. So I'm hoping you can see this now.
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So kind of obviously very similar territory, Alison, light systems and ecology. And I guess I just wanted to give a little bit of background about my practice, because it's quite eclectic in a way. And for me, there seems to be a very kind of consistent thread through, but I think from the outside, sometimes it looks like I'm just doing a lot of random things, but either the kind of conceptual thinking or the idea of light as material, or looking at ideas around the way we interact with the environment and understand ourselves as part of the bigger system. All of those things are informing the practice in various different ways. So the practice can kind of manifest either. I've done quite a lot of work in live performance, doing projected environments and kind of using projection as light as well as kind of as well as cinematically. So sometimes it's content, but sometimes it's more lighting. So kind of playing with those boundaries. I've done lots of work in planetariums. So I guess my practice in some ways is based in moving image, but the interpretation of that is quite broad and often becomes more about light than the content of the moving image itself. But I have done lots of work with planetariums and collaborating with astronomers around kind of ways we're representing ourselves and our relationship to kind of the bigger system that we exist in. And I also have then a practice that kind of sits within a gallery space. So sometimes that's print-based, sometimes it's object-based, but very often it's still connected to the idea of kind of narrative and sequences, and also often connected to light. So light can sometimes be about, it's sometimes the medium, sometimes the subject, but often also kind of experiential. So in terms of projection design, as I said, kind of working a lot with live performance, and very often kind of breaking out of a kind of standard rectangular frame for moving image. So that might be actually kind of using lights, physical lights, as you can see on the left. We were kind of animating with physical lights to create an experience. Other times it's been much more specific, where it's kind of mapping to particular parts of a kind of dancers' bodies. And other times it's creating whole worlds. So the circus project in the middle was kind of a project about circus animals, and circus animals dreaming of being circus performers who were dreaming of being animals. So it kind of went around in crazy loops.
Sorry, can I just quickly interject? We're only seeing a front screen there. I think you're referring to some pictures.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to stop and share a whole screen. Hang on a second. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
I don't quite know what the system is going to give you. I'm going to just share. I'll just share my desktop, and you'll get a bit of a feedback loop for a moment. But can you now see lighting, design, and projection?
Yeah, great.
Okay, so the previous one was practice of light, moving across objects, moving image, planetarium domes, gallery spaces, etc. And then looking at examples of using light and projection in live performance. And then also planetarium. So I had the opportunity to work in a planetarium in Australia in the late 1990s, working with an astronomy team to kind of look at how did we communicate the history of visual storytelling within astronomy and within the planetarium sector. And I have to say, like, I always had quite a fascination for the stars and the way we kind of told the stories about them, but working closely with the astronomers and kind of getting their perspective on it, but also then kind of having the job to translate that for audiences, kind of got me hooked. So I guess a lot of the practice that I've done since that time is still connected to that kind of scientific foundation. And I do work collectively with astronomers and other astrophysicists and various others, kind of as an ongoing thing. But very much the practice is informed by those kind of scientific ideas, but also looking at how we can think about those from different perspectives, rather than maybe in the slightly locked in view that comes from astrophysics itself. So in 2014, I started a PhD at Royal College of Art, which was looking at light and kind of looking at how to almost articulate the way we experience light. And what came out of that in a very short version was that really the only way we can understand and describe our experience of light is from an ecological perspective. And I mean that in the broadest sense. So looking at something from many, many different perspectives and seeing that as part of a kind of integral system that is kind of governed by that kind of governs all the kind of subsystems. And one of the things that came out of that for me was this idea that actually in any given era or epoch, the way we understand light and the way that we interpret light, whether it's kind of as religious or whether it's, kind of the gods, natural kind of gods or systems, or whether now it's much more kind of as a technological approach, it sort of reflects the thinking of a society. So that was a really big part of the research. But what I developed was a method for observing light in real time, and recording changes in light over a period of a year, as a way of kind of observing the larger system. So each of the little iterations in each of these images was an observation of light for a particular day in a month, and that over the year then you get the kind of the sense of the expansion and contraction of the moving of the planet. So it was like a small action of observation, which I described in the end as a method called attentive observation, and I'll come back to that a bit later. But so this idea of attending to small actions to get a sense of the big picture is also something that kind of works in an ecological perspective, and certainly in terms of the climate, the way we understand climate and our relationship to it. So just very quickly, this was kind of like a sample of the data sets that I was collecting, and it was just really beautiful things of seeing the way the colour changed over the year and with the seasons and the different amounts of light, obviously, but also there was days where the rain was just falling, so you just get these grey stripes. And so that was sort of one of the, I got slightly obsessed about this for a few years, but it really did change the way I was seeing things and changed my sense of place in the environment. And following on from that, I was invited to work with Adrian LaHood, who's an architect at Royal College of Art, and he'd done research around climate change, migration, and global warming, and had done a series of standard frame videos that hadn't been really had much impact, but we decided to have a look at how that information might translate. So David, this does come back to some of the questions you've posed, but how putting it into a planetarium dome space, in which the audience are immersed in the data, whether that would change the kind of relationship to it. So obviously we get very kind of, I guess, jaded about seeing information feeds of data and all the problems and all the things that we think we can't fix, and we get a bit kind of blind to it, I guess. So climate crimes really ask the question of, can we re-engage audiences in quite a personal way by kind of placing people inside this space? So we can come back to that as part of the discussion, but I just thought it was useful to kind of show you a little bit of what that looked like. I've recently done a project, and this is just a few samples, but kind of covering the sorts of things that I do. So I recently did a project with a group of young people from Cumbria in Grisdale Forest, which was again applying those exact same principles of learning to think ecologically in order to kind of see ourselves as part of a system to ideally initiate and inspire behaviour change. So the participants were kind of 11 to 14. And we spent 2 days in the forest really doing attentive observation practices, so listening and looking at different kind of systems, whether it was insects or plants or scale of things, and getting really down to tiny details. And then we then spent 2 days in the studio where they collected materials and started to curate or animate or create structures in response to their experience in the forest, and really just kind of looking at this idea of cultivating ecological perspectives, really with the intention of changing behaviour or bringing awareness to the issues that we're facing, and also to give them a voice and kind of understand what their feeling was about the current situation. And then the final project I just wanted to mention is I'm currently doing an R&D process for a full dome film that integrates real-time interactivity through using the participants' breath. So kind of building on climate crimes and looking at whether that kind of relationship between the viewer and the material can be extended further by like really bringing the body into relation with the content. So just thought it's useful. Sorry, I've probably gone too long, but hopefully that's useful just to give a bit of perspective on the sorts of things and the thinking behind the work that I've been doing. And a lot of, I won't go through this, but a lot of the kind of theories that I've been looking at are based on the work of James Gibson. He's an ecological psychologist from the late 20th century. So there is kind of, again, a kind of scientific or psychological foundation to a lot of the work that I've been developing in the last kind of 5 years, I guess. So yeah, that's it. I'll just stop sharing and come back. So hopefully that's not too long. It's always hard to cut yourself down, but hopefully that gives a bit of a sense of what goes on.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing those. I think already a number of very interesting things coming out of that, but I think from both of them, the first thing that springs to mind for me is that when we think of climate crisis, we think of rising sea levels, we think of polar ice caps, we think of temperatures, but actually I think what's also great to think about is going into a forest and looking at what's there. It's thinking about bees. It's thinking about actually some of these more everyday stories, I suppose, that are closer to home that actually are also really important to be talking about. So I think that's a really interesting starting point. So the first thing that I'd like to kind of ask is something you both talked about there, which is the relationship between the work you create in the science and scientists. Again, obviously the climate crisis is something that has been led by what scientists are working on and telling us. I mean, how much do you think your work and this sort of work should be about explaining and communicating the facts of the climate crisis? Do you think that's kind of where this work really starts from? It's about getting that science and turning it into something that people can more easily understand. Maybe Alison, starting with you, is that how you come to this work?
Not really, no. I mean, I think it's a really important part of my practice sort of generally, but in terms of individual artworks and in terms of my process, I think I don't necessarily always start with the science. I think that I've been informed massively by the science in the projects that I've mentioned, particularly today. And for those projects, it kind of did start from there. But I feel like as artists, if you kind of put yourself into that kind of frame of, I create art that communicates science, then you're kind of limiting yourself quite a lot in terms of what you can then go on to create. I think from within my work in the last few years, it's been a really brilliant kind of step into a new world of making art where you can kind of collaborate with people, understand what it is that they do, understand the science that they're doing, the data that they're collecting, the kind of the hidden stories within their research. Because I think, Chris is a really good science communicator himself, and the team at NCAS are also brilliant science communicators, but they talk a lot about how, it's really difficult for scientists often to actually relay this information to people and to kind of give a kind of experience that actually people engage with fully and understand. And I think the creation of artwork that translates that data with that, the climate canopy in particular has been really powerful, and it's definitely something that I'm really passionate about. I wouldn't say it's the core of everything that I do or will be in the future. I think I will probably continue to work with scientists on some pieces, but then also work more independently, kind of being inspired by the science that I've interacted with, or being inspired by kind of global issues and global stories, but not always sort of pinned to that particular thing.
Yeah, and Michaela, what about you? I mean, where do you see this balance between this work sort of trying to communicate important science, and then I suppose you're kind of coming at it from the perspective of the artist? I mean, where does that come from?
It's actually very similar to what Alison has just said. So, and it does vary project to project. So Climate Crimes, for example, is very factually based. It uses a lot of NASA data. The information that we're providing is absolutely solid and accounted for. The statistics, the numbers, the dates, all of it is kind of drawn from not only science, but also kind of political. And interesting that Alison mentioned COP, because Climate Crimes talks about a COP, a situation that took place at COP in 2015, in which there was a kind of backroom deal done by the kind of Northern Hemisphere nations that would have brought the kind of average global temperature up to 3.5 degrees. And so then there was a response from Dumumba Diaping, who was the Sudanese negotiator at the time, saying, you've just gone and sold us out, basically. So there's this fantastic kind of narrative completely based on real world factual information. And I think in that one, it was really important to say, this is actually real. It's not speculation. It's not a proposition or a proposal. It's actually what's happening in the world. And we were really surprised when Climate Crimes got accepted to screen at COP last year, because it's quite critical. And I don't know that the census actually watched it. I don't know if we shouldn't say that, it's live stream, but yeah, so it was, for us, it was fantastic that it got to screen there, because it really did bring some of the systems that are in play politically as well into question, but supported that with the facts. And I think in that instance, it was so important that that kind of scientific information was genuine and kind of backed up multiple times, because it then couldn't be picked apart. But in other projects, so I did a different project in Grisdale Forest a couple of years ago with astrophysicists from the Cosmoparticle Institute at, oh God, sorry, my brain's just gone blank. Anyway, UCL, thank you, sorry. Which was a fantastic collaboration that took place over 6 months with teams of young designers and early career researchers. And actually, a lot of the work that ended up in the exhibition at Grisdale Forest had nothing to do with the science whatsoever. And it was much more about the experience of the concepts that they were talking about. So it wasn't fact, we'd kind of gone through the thing of saying, well, these are the facts, but actually what we wanted was more than the facts, and to get people to understand systems or the kind of scale of things, or even the way scientists were approaching the work, rather than saying, here's the science. And what came out of that, a lot of the participants came and invigilated the show, and the feedback was that there was actually opportunities in that situation to have kind of real world conversations about the science, rather than the more kind of formal science communication, which obviously Alison's mentioned as well. But the science communication sits within a certain kind of frame of storytelling. And it seems often that maybe there's not as much license in the way stories are told within that field as we can kind of bring to it from coming at it from a completely different or much more exploratory or experimental perspective. And I think, you know, there was things, not to be critical, but the ways of thinking, they're very set in the way they're taught to think. And that sometimes thinking outside of those set ways, this was more for the younger people collaborating, but thinking outside the set ways that they'd been taught to think was actually really challenging, because it then brought everything into question. So if you're a young astrophysicist and you've been told to think in a particular way, and someone says, you can look over there, and they're like, oh my God, the whole thing that I've just built on this structure is like just dissolved into dust. Those situations are really challenging. So I think the science collaborations are very interesting. And you need to build good relationships with people to to get it to be productive, I think.
Well, let's talk about that then. So if there are people out there who are interested in making work with scientists, as you've both done, I mean, how have you sort of gone about actually making those relationships, dare I say, persuading them sometimes that, you know, this is a good idea? I mean, how might one go about actually trying to make those connections?
I mean, the way I've already kind of touched upon the fact that the Creative Labs programme that is run in Leeds by Opera North and the Cultural Institute, that was an amazing programme to be part of, and I think it's still running now. It just runs with different faculties at the university each year, and that allowed me to work with Chris to sort of develop lots and lots of different ideas. There was no kind of pressure to create a particular piece at the end of the scheme. It was a sort of 6-month collaboration period. And through that 6 months, Chris and I sort of talked about many different possible things that we could work on together and develop into something. And the Nectary was the one that kind of ended up, becoming a reality. I think I didn't feel like I had to persuade him in the slightest. I mean, Chris was a very active collaborator in the project, and the funding that we got through Leeds Light Night, through the Cultural Institute and a couple of other places, was not, I think once we had that strong concept there, the funding wasn't that difficult to access, because there was kind of an active, Light Night being this kind of annual event, and they're really keen to host new work from local artists. So that was it was sort of a fairly open door. And then I think with Climate Canopy, I started working with the National Centre for Atmospheric Science through Chris, so through the university, on another project that they're working with him on, which was actually really interesting. It's called Bauer. It's about how they use weather radar to detect insects. So you can kind of see like a cloud of insects, like when it's flying ant day, or equivalents with other large kind of swarms of insects, and they can see them on weather radar. So they're looking at how they can use that data that's normally just sort of wasted and ignored by the meteorologists. So Chris then put me in touch with NCAS, and we had various different conversations, but eventually it was that NCAS kind of came to me and said, we want to create something for COP. Could you pitch an idea? And so they kind of were really at the forefront of pushing that through. So I found it that way around. And actually I created a piece for a virologist during that kind of period as well, Professor Nicola Stonehouse from Leeds University. And again, she kind of came to me. I think there are like lots of quite forward thinking scientists who are really keen to work with artists to help to communicate these ideas. That's kind of been my perspective on it.
Michaela, you've mentioned that in the work you've done with scientists, you've been able to encourage them to, look a different direction, think in a different way. I mean, is there anything that you've kind of taken from their approach that has?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like for me, quite often it's actually led to quite a lot of investigation of what it is to do interdisciplinary projects and interdisciplinary practice. And there's lots of research going on into what actually makes a good kind of interdisciplinary project, and just really basic things like using plain language and being able to speak to each other without your kind of jargon. And it makes you very aware of, how much when you're at the RCA in a design school, how much that becomes kind of a little enclave where you all know what you're talking about, but take that to another context and everyone's just like, you're an alien, we don't know what you're doing. So it was really, it's fascinating because it makes you very aware of the kind of thinking processes or the creative processes that you kind of have naturally, or you think are natural, but are actually obviously kind of connected to your own discipline. And also then starting to unpick how other people think and where those points of contact are, I think found it really fascinating. But, for me, I think all of my practice has some sort of foundation in real world. And whether it's astrophysicists or whether it's looking more at kind of, I've just finished reading the James Nestor book about breath, because one of the new project I'm doing about breathing, I'm like, I need to understand more about breath. So I'm now taping my mouth and breathing through my nose. And it's like, it's really fantastically impactful personally, but also it's just that thing of being informed. So and also a lot for me, looking at kind of principles around ecological thinking. And yeah, I can't really imagine doing my practice without that foundation, but there's also the balance of that. So saying, well, where are the limits of the thinking of that within the scientific disciplines? Or, how can kind of a more artistic or creative approach kind of expand the models that they're coming up with, or understand how we might experience those more, or, yeah. So it's kind of looking at opportunities for one thing to feed the other a bit more, I think. And I really, in general, haven't found it to be competitive, or I think sometimes the science will kind of be the dominant thing. Like there is a tendency for the science, depending who they are, they can kind of think, culturally, we think of science as being correct and we think of arts as being interpretive. Actually, both are equally valid and equally real and equally important. So for me, I think there's often in the collaborations, not necessarily with the individuals, but from a more kind of funding perspective, I think there is an emphasis on the scientists kind of leading the way with the accuracy, but actually I think the interpretations sometimes bring another way of people understanding that accuracy, and I think that's valuable. I guess in terms of connecting with people, like one of the projects was through the Institute of Physics and their public outreach grants. So how are you involving public in terms of physics and communicating physics and so on? And I think once I'd done one of those, then you're sort of on the radar and people introduce you to people, and because of the work in the planetariums, there was also kind of threads of connections through there. So, and I think once you've done a couple, like Alison's saying, once you've worked in those sorts of collaborations, you're someone who then can show that you've got that kind of mixed understanding or that shared understanding. So, but I think any collaboration comes with its challenges, but also there's a great value with it, because you do them to expand your knowledge and to expand your the way of working, the way you're seeing things. So absolutely a really important part of my practice for sure.
But back to the idea of communicating facts. I mean, I don't know, speaking to someone that doesn't necessarily make work in this way, I feel as though with COP, with the hottest day of all time, we've been given a lot of facts and things recently, and my sort of general thinking is that most people understand the climate crisis and kind of what it is, and that it's dangerous. I mean, in terms of people like yourselves making work on this theme, do you feel that this work is now sort of going from a kind of a post-facts kind of stage where you might have to sort of start thinking differently about what you're making, that it maybe doesn't need to be quite so rooted in the science because it's something you can take for granted the audiences will understand? I don't know if you think that we might be in kind of a new kind of phase of people making work on this theme that doesn't rely so much on that side of things. I don't know what you think.
I think with the climate canopy, this might be a good opportunity to show it, because I'm aware that I keep talking about this piece that I haven't shown a picture of yet, so it doesn't really make much sense. I just share my screen. I think with that, what I was going to just sort of touch upon is that what I found is the general public's kind of perception is still, I don't necessarily think people still have like a really, really good understanding yet of the realities of the climate crisis. I think that they understand certain elements of it, but actually, the kind of real hard data that is showing us kind of what is happening is not necessarily kind of something that everybody is familiar with. So I think I kind of try to not make any assumptions about what people know or understand. And the way that the canopy was made, and actually it's touching on some of what Michaela was saying earlier, I'll just start this video because I think I've muted it so I can keep talking. Touching on what Michaela was saying, it's really crucial to have the real hard data, and to have that, to know that the science that the piece is based on is really, really solid, and that people can kind of look into it. They can look at the climate stripes online. They can read more about Ed Hawkins' research, so they can really understand, what these colours mean, what this kind of data, what this graph essentially means. So and people's sort of response to it is people are quite affected by it, and I think it's kind of what Michaela was touching on, where if you create an immersive piece, it really puts something right in front of people's faces and gives them that physical experience. So as Michaela was saying, with the kind of the full dome planetarium projections, that you're having a kind of bodily experience with this thing. With the canopy, the idea being that you walk through the 170 years of data. So as you come towards the end of the piece, which is present day climate data, you are literally walking into the data, so it physically is touching you, and you can't ignore it anymore. But I think, having those conversations with people, which again is a really important part of this work. I think, like the canopy, we're taking it to Light Up Lancaster next beginning of November, and really thinking about how we can make sure that there are people there who can have those conversations with the public, because those conversations are really, really important. They add such an element to the piece itself. But I feel like a lot of people, I'm talking over this video, so you can't hear what people are saying, but a lot of people are kind of quite shocked at the reality of the data, and therefore kind of talking about how they didn't really realise that this is, if you compare where we're at now to where we were 100 years ago, the real stark difference that you can see. I don't know if that actually answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm just interested in this because if I think about let's use the example of, if we're writing historical fiction or we're doing, something on that theme, we can play a bit with the facts. No one's expecting that to be completely true. We can take artistic license. Michaela, is there a reason why we don't feel that we can necessarily take artistic license with the climate crisis? Yeah.
Well, it's sort of interesting, actually, and I just wanted to reiterate. I think in some ways it's hilarious because I find Alison is often speaking for me. I'm like, yeah, exactly. So you've got to we're very in line with the way we're approaching this, but a lot of the climate crime screenings and a lot of the work that I've done subsequently are connected to conversations. So very often the work would screen and then there would be a public kind of Q&A or debate or discussion facilitated by the venue, really to kind of like give people an opportunity to like debrief maybe a little bit, because it's pretty brutal in the way that it delivers facts. It's true, but it's brutal. So yeah, that like surrounding conversation is such a huge part of the work, and I think for me coming at those conversations from this ecological approach and saying, in my own work, this thing that's really evident is the small action. As an animator, the small action is the way that you get to the big story. I think I've gone kind of off the question, David, but I think at the end of every screening, people are like, but what can we do? What can we do? So, you walk through, and the piece looks beautiful, Alison, by the way, but you can imagine that people are getting to that end of the piece and kind of like there's a sense of panic and disaster. And then the kind of subsequent thing is going, yeah, but what do you do? You can change plastic, or you can, but like there's not this sense of those small actions adding up to the change, even though it's the small actions over that kind of social history we're going back to your question, that history over the last 200 years is really what's led to this outcome or this situation. And that's a million small actions that build to that big outcome. So I think there's just like communicating that it is those small actions, not waiting for COP26 to make a decree as to how we all have to change behaviour, because that's not coming.
Yeah, well, but
I'd like to think it was, but
fingers crossed. I mean that leads to one of the main things I wanted to talk about, which is that, again, work that responds to the climate crisis. Do you feel as though that has kind of a natural necessity to inspire its audiences to take action, or that work does it need to have a kind of an advocatory purpose? Do you kind of feel that burden that people see your work and they should want to take action? They should want to go on marches and do whatever it is to make an impact. I mean, maybe Alison, starting with you, is that a really important driver of what you do?
I think it kind of is, because it sort of has to be. I mean, with the Nectary, it's less of a. I mean, we do have like information around there, and we have kind of conversations with people, and there's this interest in what can we do to support pollinating insects? What can we, little things you can do at home? And I think actually a lot of people already, it feels like people are much more familiar with that as a kind of a sort of smaller, more manageable, more kind of at-home issue around, I mean, obviously it's something that we individually can contribute to a little bit, but there's a much broader issue around the use of pesticides. And so again, it becomes that, well, I can do my little part, but the bigger picture is out of my hands. I think with Climate Canopy, it definitely feels like much more of a core element of it is around inspiring change. And around kind of having those conversations, as Michaela said. I think it's, you people feel a bit despairing, and in fact we have a soundscape that goes with the piece, and my husband's a music producer and runs a recording studio, and he made the soundscape for me, and he was like, okay, yes, a climate crisis, I know what we're going for, and he created this piece of music which was beautiful but really depressing. And I was like, no, hun, you need to change the key a little bit, just give us some hope in there, because what I was really aware of is that if people come into this space and you've got this really depressing soundscape and this, once they learn what the piece is and what they're walking through, this really quite depressing and panic inducing thing to see where we're at compared to the last 170 years, it's quite difficult for people, I think, and for all of us to sort of see that reality. So I think having that hope, we can change things, we can do things, these are kind of ways that you can find out more about what you can do. So I think that really is kind of built into that piece for me, and is a really, really core part of it.
And Michaela, what about you? I mean, do you think this type of work has to have that kind of impetus to it to inspire action?
I think it's sort of an interesting question, because I think ultimately it comes down to the individual maker as to whether it has to or not. For me, I say yes, and I think every film I've ever made from really early, before there was even a climate crisis that we knew about, there was still kind of this drive to kind of encourage audiences to see the world differently, or to think outside of the kind of frames that we're given in mainstream kind of models, or so always this kind of motivation to kind of expand perspectives or awareness or understanding in some way. And often that was kind of by making very mundane things seem beautiful, or telling stories that would kind of twist something on its head, and you'd be like, oh, I've never thought about it that way. So it was sort of, that's always been kind of a kind of driver in my practice, I guess. With the more recent works, I think Alison's saying, this stuff is depressing. The truth is, it is depressing and it is difficult, but it's going to get more difficult when we're actually living with this in the way it's going to be. There's no sugarcoating it when it's here. There's no sugarcoating 40 degrees in Yorkshire. And I've just come back from a month in Australia, which is probably, in terms of my ecological footprint, pretty bad, but I haven't been for 5 years, so maybe I balance it. I've never seen so much water in my life. There was floods everywhere. I mean, that's in Australia, and you're like, whoa, that's just weird. So the system is seriously kind of shifting at the moment. And I think, again, going back to climate crimes, that we made that in 2018 based on data coming out of 2015. There's a point in that where they set 2030 as the year where the kind of crisis really is going to kick in. Not so much in the UK, but certainly in kind of the African nations and the kind of lower lying island states and so on. So we're going to see the impact of that in 2030. Now, when we made that in 2018, 2030 seemed a long way away. So when this screened at COP last year, it's like, oh my God, that's actually not very far. And every year the film gets more kind of potent because that deadline gets closer. So I think there is an urgency. And for me in making that film, and for Adrian, who kind of provided the kind of research that started it, there was this sense of urgency, and that actually we can't just say it's all okay and it's uncomfortable, so here's a way to make it all nice again. I think it's getting to the point where actually the niceties are in the way. And I think, a lot of the way the climate crisis is packaged in the media is very much in this kind of dumbed down, palatable model to avoid public crisis or panic or whatever. But, if you do look at the data, there's the Jem Bendell article, which I think came out around kind of 2016, 2018. I don't know if you know that piece, but he took a year's sabbatical and did a survey of all the climate data, and kind of, it's very worst case scenario, but it's sobering. So I feel like we're pretty, as a species, we're pretty resistant to taking action that is uncomfortable for us. And we're very, very programmed to think, to be comfortable. And it's hard to give that up. I mean, I don't give up much. I'm very comfortable. But I'm aware that that means choices and impact. And I guess there just is the thing that we're consumers, and every breath is consuming, and every breath has impact, and every choice we make has impact. And the servers that we're using here today have impact, and all the rendering time of me making the film that's supposed to raise the discussion had huge impact. And then I'm showing it in planetariums, which are like completely power hungry entertainment environments. So, you know, the whole thing is just like deeply problematic.
Yeah, well, I want to come on to that in a second, but I was just going to bring up. I'm going to ask both of you later if you've got any, you know, other artworks or whatnot you'd recommend to people having a look at. And I think what you were just saying there very much comes to mind, the film "Don't Look Up," which I think a lot of people will have seen. But that sort of idea of trying to find ways to sugarcoat or, you know, kind of put it to one side. You know, actually, I think that's probably the most mainstream example of a piece of art that's been created that responds to the climate crisis, and I think it's definitely worth a horrifying and sometimes amusing watch. You brought it up there, and it goes back to what we were talking about at 2 o'clock earlier this afternoon, which is making work in a more sustainable way. When you're making work that's talking about the climate crisis, do you kind of look to make that in a sustainable way? Again, do you think that's important? I'll come to you first, Michaela, because you mentioned there about putting on films in power-hungry auditoriums. I mean, how much is that something that kind of plays on you when you're thinking about this work?
I mean, this work was a very interesting work, and I didn't really mention this in the preamble for it, but the relationship with this work is the kind of pollution generated by the kind of industrialized north and some of the industrialized south, but primarily from the northern hemisphere, is impacting sea temperatures that kind of control the rain levels in North Africa, so in the Sahel region. And that's leading to drought and leading to reduction of arable land and leading to conflict. And then, of course, that leads to migration within that region, but also then that kind of population is leading to migration across the Mediterranean. So the film was made in 2016 through to 18, which was when there was the peak of the migration kind of coming across the Mediterranean, all the footage of, you know, immigrants in their life vests floating across the sea and arriving in Crete and Greece and Italy and so on, and kind of everyone not knowing what to do with that influx. But it basically looked like an exchange program. So the pollutants go down, the impact has the impact, and the migrants come up. So it's like, I can't actually remember your question now, David, which is terrible. But can you just remind me where I was headed with that?
It was whether when you're making work that responds to the crisis, you're thinking about how it's made. So
the thing for me in that story was there was the big picture of all the NASA data showing the kind of flows of temperature and the impact of pollutants and aerosol particles that can be traced back within a mile of where they've been sourced, so they all know where they're coming from. The impact is clear, the science is clear, and then there was the footage of individuals floating across the sea, and I used real footage of people. I have no idea who they are, I have no idea whether they survived or not. But I wanted it to be this thing where actually each of those people who appear in the film as these little floating bodies, their best choice was to jump in an ocean in a life vest. I mean, that's so far from comfortable, but that's their best choice, is to say that's it, the only option. So I think when I was making the film, there was this sense of trying to communicate their story as individuals. So this small kind of like individual experience of this massive thing, but also to kind of raise that in relation to what my experience of that might be. And as the maker, sitting in the comfort of my studio with a power supply that I pay for through my bills every month, and I've got an income to do that. And I'm very, very, very aware of that I don't have solar panels on my roof, but I do subscribe to a green provider, but I can afford to. So I think it raised so many questions, David. Just and server time, and you know, distributing of files through online systems, and we take it all for granted. And I think you know, today I had the experience of suddenly my phone in the middle of traveling somewhere this morning said I didn't have any network access. And I'm like, I don't know where I'm going. So we're like completely dependent on these systems that are absolutely at odds with the stories that we're telling.
Yeah.
So it is a dilemma. I mean, I would like to think that I could, you know, it raises conversations like this, and maybe the planetarium sector post-COVID, because they're obviously in crisis during lockdown, maybe it can become greener, and maybe every dome should be covered with its own solar array, you know, and self-sufficient and feeding a local grid. That would be the ideal scenario. But all of those things require, as the people in the previous session were saying, require additional time and money and infrastructure and people passionate enough to kind of make those things possible.
Yeah, and something we touched on very briefly earlier, but it's all worth remembering, is that when we're working online or whatnot, that we're doing it in a very green way, for want of a better word. But as you said, every email that we send has an impact. Streaming things, uploading things. We forget the internet is real things. It's real big boxes that take up an enormous amount of power that, you know, we're having to use, you know, so that, you know, there are all sorts of different things we have to think about, you know, doing
there
things.
Just on that, there is a new project. I've got some funding through the XR Stories program at York University, and there's 3 companies being commissioned to do projects, of which I'm working with Live Cinema UK for one of them. But there is another company, which if you look it up, I'm sure you'll find the link, who are looking at exactly that. What is the carbon footprint for our internet and kind of online usage? So whether it's browsing the internet or whether it's like having your, you know, your smart house responding through a server to turn your lights on and off, that's carbon footprint, rather than just going over there and switching the light. It's actually activating server activity elsewhere. So the carbon footprint of smart lives is actually probably higher than we think. So there is a project that's starting to look at how is that actually translating into I don't know what their kind of measure will be. But this, obviously, in the previous session there was the thing of the translation to air miles or to other equivalents. So it will be interesting to see what comes out of that project. Because I think, as you say, it's certainly not something that we're considering in our day-to-day use of computer spaces.
No, absolutely not. So, I mean, Alison, also on that point, then, when you're making, you know, the canopy or whatever it might be, you know, how much are you considering, you know, sustainable or greener ways of actually making work as well? Is that something that is very conscious for you when creating these things?
Yeah, it is definitely. I mean, it's, I think, as Michaela said, there are certain kind of systems that you would, you know, I would like to be able to do things in a different way, but there are certain things that, you know, you can't really get around. So like with the LED bars that I sourced for the climate canopy, you know, we had to source them new. We couldn't buy reused versions of them. We weren't able to source them. So you kind of have, there's a certain element of like investing in new products, and they have got plastic in them. They were made in Germany and they had to be shipped from Germany. So we had to kind of think about all of those things. But being that this piece was being made for COP, we were very hyper aware of that. So COP, like many events now, obviously COP being very much at the forefront of this, had a real kind of green agenda in terms of all the exhibitors, all of the suppliers to the exhibition, to the conference and the events around it, had to give a kind of a real, I can't remember the name of the document they ask you to fill out, but a kind of an audit, I guess, like a green audit, to show what where your things have been sourced from, how they're being transported, what will happen to them afterwards, and then obviously things like consumables and how, you know, they're being sourced, and making sure that's in the most sustainable way. So yeah, there are certain things like buying lighting that it's more difficult to do, but I think I'm always really aware of what things can become and how things can be reused. So in all of my work, I'm constantly thinking about, well, yeah, I mean, I'm having to store things, as I know was sort of discussed in the last session, that we're trying to reuse things and kind of purpose things for future projects means that you do have to kind of keep a lot of stuff and store a lot of stuff. But that's part of it. But then also within my kind of the sort of more making element of my work, the recycled materials, as I said at the beginning, was always a really, really core part of my practice. So sourcing all the materials as kind of recycled, at source, whether that's through me collecting things, whether it's through, there's a place in Leigh called Scrap, which is amazing, Scrap Creative Reuse. So I source quite a lot of stuff through them because they get the kind of industrial levels of plastic, that some of it they will sell, some of it's, that they sell sort of in small pieces to schools and to artists, but there'll be some things where they'll come out to me and go like, Alison, do you want this enormous roll of like random really thick white plastic that nobody else wants? And I'm like, yes, give me more. Like, I'm kind of like love having all those like industrial sized rolls of stuff that they otherwise just have no use for and would potentially end up in landfill. So yeah, it is a big part of what I do, and it does, every little thing has an impact, and down to, I mean, I know in the last session you mentioned things like cable ties. Like, cable ties are gold dust to me. Like, they are an amazing, I use them quite a lot, but I use the reusable ones. But it's different little things like, if I'm not there installing a piece or de-rigging a piece, that I need to then make sure that all of that my technicians or that the people at the event who are involved, that don't you be cutting my reusable cable ties. So, and you kind of have to share that knowledge around. I mean, I was at a festival recently in summer at Blue Dot. They didn't even know reusable cable ties existed, and yet they had them in their hands. So someone there had been cutting the reusable cable ties without realizing that they could just undo them. I know that's a really silly like little thing, but all those kind of little things, and it causes you kind of guilt and pain a lot. I mean, literally this morning I'm rewiring an old piece from about 7 years ago, and the wire connectors are these little kind of waterproof wire connectors, but every time that one doesn't work, that's it, it's gone. So then I'm having rage because I'm not only is the thing not being wired together, but also I'm throwing away this tiny piece of plastic, and it kind of adds to the stress levels that you then feel really responsible for creating this rubbish as you're working. So yeah, it's definitely sort of inbuilt in what I do, as far as I can reasonably manage.
I'm doing an exhibition following on from the workshop with the young people in the Grisdale project space, starting in a couple of weeks. And the whole project is about non-consumption and the challenge of making an exhibition and not consuming. So, I'm like, oh, maybe it'd be nice to frame that one. And then I'm like, but do we need another frame? I don't think so. So actually, like, it's really interesting how, exactly as Alison's saying, how that kind of changes almost the aesthetics in the air. I've got a vision in my head of what I would like that space to look like and how I would like it to feel. But if I limit what new materials or even recycled materials I can bring to that, if I just use what's there, it's sort of, I mean, I'm at the moment, I'm thinking there's one of my favorite things in an exhibition is magnets, because you can just keep resticking them and reusing them 100 times over, and no frames. It's just paper. But even the printing of materials, or we were talking the other day about aesthetically, it's really nice to have vinyl cut, but then we're like, well, it's vinyl cutting, so actually that doesn't work for this project. So what does work for the project is actually to not have an exhibition, really. But then you don't communicate what's going on, and it might be that actually someone going to the exhibition sees something in a different way, and that's the motivation to kind of drive change in a whole other context than the one that we initially worked in. So, it's that kind of dilemma between telling the story and getting the story out there, versus the kind of not wanting to consume anything. So I think that's the challenge as artists and makers, is to try to find that balance point. And you know, I do like to do a bit of guerrilla tree planting as a kind of counterpoint. I don't know that that actually makes enough difference, but you know, the more that, speaking of good films, there is a really beautiful film called Kiss the Ground, which is, it's all about, it's on Netflix, so you've got to stream it, which obviously has its own implications, but it's all about the kind of revitalization of soil and the value of trees in kind of drawing down the carbon and all plants, and basically the healthier the soil, the more carbon it can hold. So actually, in terms of like a hopeful point in all the madness, that actually is one where you're like, yeah, we could do this. So yeah, I think that's like those small kind of shifts in the way we're thinking about what an exhibition might be or could be. It's interesting because I think it will in the end start to impact the way we're using materials and the aesthetics that we're bringing. And maybe it's fine to actually make your signs on recycled cardboard boxes.
Yeah, well, it was, as again we were saying earlier, you know, we either think about this as having to make compromises, or we think of this as a creative opportunity.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
You know, as creative people, hopefully we can look at it that way. I love that thing, Alison, as well, of people having reusable cable ties and cutting them. That seems to be sort of a mini sort of artwork in itself on our, you know, inability to realise kind of what we've got. But I'll leave that to you artists.
Yeah.
This is so a final kind of call for questions. We've had one come in, which I will ask now. Then I've got a final point. What was my question? Yes, the question that came in, sorry, was about visual art and installations, which is obviously what you both work in. I should say it's complete coincidence we have two artists who work with light this afternoon. It's complete coincidence. And whether you think there is something special about either visual arts or the installations that is particularly effective in talking about the climate crisis, as opposed to a film, a play, a piece of music, you know, whatever it might be. Is there something special about this type of work that is particularly effective, do you think?
I mean, in my experience, I think having created installations for a few years and kind of much smaller scale in the beginnings of my practice, but I think working in that way where you're creating a space that people step into and that they experience kind of fully with multiple senses, I think that has a real kind of benefit in terms of people engaging fully with an idea and a concept and being able to use multi-senses, so sound, light, kind of I mean, I use haze in the climate canopy, and actually that was a really good point that was made in the first session, and I'm going to be thinking carefully about what chemical I use in my haze. But creating those kind of spaces that people dwell in for, it may be 5 minutes, it may be 20 minutes, but it's something that you can't kind of escape it. It's not I mean, for me, it's not never really a picture on a wall, or it's not a kind of a film that you can kind of be on your phone whilst you're watching it and not really like fully immersed in. So I think there is that kind of that immersive element to these kind of installations. Definitely helps, I think, with those messages.
Michaela?
Completely agree. And I think, you know, in doing research in art and design, there is this idea of different ways of knowing. So there's an intellectual and kind of theoretical and academic way of knowing, not necessarily in academia, but, you know, we look at the facts, we hear the facts, we understand the facts, but it's compartmentalized in a kind of a filed knowledge system, essentially. So we could maybe even like repeat the facts, but not be engaged in them in any way. And then there's this other way of knowing, which is an experiential or embodied way of knowing. So it's like, you know, to learn to play the piano or the violin or something, you would not anticipate that someone would learn it completely by reading a book. In order to do it, you have to actually practice and do it physically until your body remembers what that action is and what that shape is. And I think there is such an emphasis in our kind of society on intellectual understanding and very little emphasis on embodied knowledge, and that actually we use our embodied experience primarily for entertainment, where we don't want to think about stuff and we don't want to actually have to be challenged or learn things more deeply, perhaps. So using installation or using, for me, spatial projection is a way to kind of engage people in an embodied experience and a different way of knowing. And I think the challenge, and it sounds like Alison is doing exactly the same thing, the challenge then is to go, well, how do you translate that kind of intellectual knowledge into a form that's receivable through experience? So obviously, like, you know, I don't want to offend you, Alison, but at a very base level, that's data visualization. Yeah. But obviously taking that into a spatial realm so people are experiencing that, it's a very different thing than putting the facts on a list. So it's about the way that we understand that as an experience actually changes our relationship to the information. And I think with climate crimes and with subsequent projects and the new one with the breath, for me, each time I'm saying, well, you know, does kind of embedding that in a spatial and embodied experience change our relationship to the fact? And the evidence would suggest repeatedly, but anecdotally, that, yeah, it absolutely changes it. And now kind of taking the breath into that same scenario, going, well, how much more would that impact the kind of understanding or connection or empathy or, you know, motivation for action if the breath is also tied to a narrative about that system and our place in it? So less factual, that one's much more kind of, I guess, experimental and exploratory, but still looking at those, how that kind of physical relationship to our environment can actually help us learn and help us understand in different ways. You know, for me, this sounds really crazy, but if you really want to know what's going on in the world, go hug a tree. You know, like just get back out there and remember that there's a whole real world and it's living and it's alive and it's solid and it's not like conceptual. So I think, you know, get your feet on the ground and go to a forest and talk to rangers who are like working the forest, and you remember that actually there's a whole world out there that I think it's really easy to forget about.
Yeah, so, well, it's as we were saying at the very start that, you know, we have lots of these big numbers and big things happening with the world, but actually there's a lot we can do and understand just by going outside.
And I think like that forest project that I did with the young people, a lot of that was actually about learning from the rangers to understand how are they working in the forest. One, to kind of like look at future resilience. So how are they planting, changing the planting rhythms and the types of things they're planting so that in 30 years it will be a resilient system. But also really basic things like, you know, if they clear an area, the trees in the edge become really vulnerable. So what do they kind of do to protect them from windfall? And there's like these crazy, fascinating little details that actually people are really working in the real world to solve a lot of the things that we see as a result of the crisis. But actually, once you start kind of, I think, was it Marla this afternoon said about the idea of kind of working collectively, that we can't all have all the knowledge, but to know that the foresters are really working on this and thinking like long term about this is sort of great. And that if every industry is doing a similar thing, not waiting for the top down pronouncement that it's time to act, then actually it's kind of encouraging in a way. So I don't think we are without hope. I think we're without communication. And actually, maybe that's where our job comes in, is to say, actually, there are people doing stuff and things are happening and it is possible.
Yeah, well, I like to give people some hope, so that's good to know. The final thing, then, kind of very briefly, is just kind of anything you want to leave people with. If there's you know, other artists or other particular works you think it's worth people, you know, kind of looking into. The one I kind of really wanted to suggest is a film called Can I Live, which is by the writer and actor Fenty Balogun. It was made by Complicité Theatre. It was going to be a stage show, but then COVID happened to turn it into a film. It's fantastic. It's about an hour long. And it's about Fenty's kind of journey into discovering about climate activism as a person of colour with very few role models to kind of in that world. His journey into activism. It involves a lot of activists of kind of colour. It's as I was saying earlier, it's a great piece that really does inspire you to want to go and get a placard and kind of do something about it. I don't think it's playing anywhere at the moment, but I'd suggest going to Complicité's website, have a look at Can I Live. Fantastic film, one of the best things I've seen made about the climate crisis. Alison, anything from you you'd like to leave people with?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head, actually. I'm trying to like hunt through my database of things I've seen recently, but I can't think of anything off the top of my head. If I do, I will definitely drop it in the chat.
Yeah, I think it is telling though, because I mean, generally speaking, for me, there doesn't seem to be a wealth of material actually that's kind of been made on this subject. I mean, we mentioned that Netflix film Don't Look Up. You know, there's kind of, and obviously there's potentially more work in the visual and installation arts, but it does seem striking to me that there maybe isn't.
There is a really fantastic book by a professor of art history called Andrew Patrizio. He's based in Edinburgh, and he writes an alternate history of reasonably contemporary art practices. That's called The Ecological Eye. It's fantastic. It looks at kind of ecological perspectives in line with kind of my other minority art histories. So whether it's a Black history or whether it's like gender histories or kind of how different groups are represented, and he kind of draws a parallel to the ecological perspectives kind of fed through art. It's a fantastic book, and really, yeah, for me, kind of actually my PhD was the pivotal point that made everything come together. But it's really beautiful and definitely worth reading, kind of how those threads might weave back into our recent kind of cultural histories. And for me, the Kiss the Ground film, it's American, but just there's a whole principle behind that called drawdown, which basically says the more we're looking after the soil and the ground and the earth, the more carbon we can pull back in. So kind of a counterpoint to the idea of like floating technological screens above the planet and stuff like that. It's actually just let's get it back in the ground where it belongs. So yeah, that whole idea of drawdown is something else to look at, I think.
Brilliant. Alison, if people want to see your work, you said you're Lancaster, the project's going to next?
Yeah, so both pieces, the Nectary and the Climate Canopy, are going to be at Light Up Lancaster at the beginning of November. And then I've got some other events coming up, I think, in the spring, but I don't necessarily know dates and locations yet. I'm currently making a new piece for Middlesbrough, for a light festival in Middlesbrough called Nightfall, which will be on display in December, which is kind of looking more at the Northern Lights and actually using sound responsive technology. So people being able to activate a sculpture with their voice. So slightly different, but again, still rooted in natural processes, in kind of ecological phenomena, and understanding, I guess, the science behind it as well. So understanding how that energy sort of exchange happens.
Brilliant. And Michaela, if people want to find out a bit more about your work?
Website, michaelafrench.com. And currently not many screenings planned because the new project is in kind of research and development. So there's work in progress, kind of presentations coming up at the Full Dome UK Festival in Plymouth in November, which anyone interested in kind of communal immersive media experiences, come along, see what it's about. And then, yeah, local kind of user testing and screenings of work in progress in and around Leeds over the next few months, but no formal screenings. In some ways, it's nice just to have a break and actually be making something instead of putting it all out there. So once that work is kind of finished, then obviously we'll get a bit more formally publicised, I think.
Brilliant. Well, thanks both so much for joining us this afternoon. It's been fascinating to hear about your work, and thank you all for tuning in this afternoon to our Arts and Climate Symposium, the final event of this year's Leeds Opera Festival. I'm going to go and have a long lie down and a nap after a very busy couple of weeks, and we'll be back again next year with a full programme all about Latin American opera, so something very different indeed. So final thank you to Alison, Michaela, Marla, Siobhan, Roberta and George for joining us this afternoon. Goodbye.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, bye.